Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. If you pay attention to any type of news around wellness, you have undoubtedly heard about the concept of mindfulness and meditation. You may also notice there is often a very casual nod to the Buddhist traditions from which these ideas stem, but there might also be no mention of Buddhism whatsoever. The secularization of Buddhist traditions is a source of contention around the world right now as Buddhist methods and practices make their way into other realms of society normally not often associated with religious practices. For example, Buddhist applications have been reported being used in corporate settings, the U.S. military, university health centers, and the topic of today's conversation, psychotherapy. Psychotherapists relate to Buddhist traditions in different ways, as reported in the first comprehensive study on the topic from psychotherapist and Buddhist studies scholar Dr. Ira Helderman. His book, Prescribing the Dharma, Psychotherapists, Buddhist Traditions, and Defining Religion, gives direct voice to psychotherapists themselves to describe how they see what it means for a method to be religious or not religious, how they navigate the boundaries, and seek to be transparent in identifying the origin of their methods with people who come to them who may not be Buddhist, and also how they understand categories of religion and science. This book sets the stage for future decades of psychotherapy research, and you can get it from the University of North Carolina Press at the link in the show notes. As always, if you like this show, you can follow me on Twitter at classical_ideas, on Facebook at facebook.com/classicalideaspodcast, or on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Dr. Ira Helderman is a psychotherapist in private practice, and he holds a PhD in religious studies. Without further delay, here is my conversation with Dr. Ira Helderman. Dr. Ira Helderman, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Can you just spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience, however you see fit?
Well, my name is Dr. Ira Helderman. I am a religious studies scholar and a practicing psychotherapist living in Nashville, Tennessee. I also do some teaching. I'm an adjunct assistant professor at Vanderbilt University's graduate program for counselors. This most recent project, I think that you and I will be talking about, is about the way that psychotherapists have approached Buddhist traditions. But my research and writing as a whole looks at how psychotherapists and psychotherapeutic stuff influence the way people are religious in the United States.
Wonderful. So I always like to get a little bit of background on the guest, just like a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit about why you became a psychotherapist and maybe what some of your critical turning points were along your path?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a longer version, but the short version is that I was doing service work for an addictions treatment center here in Nashville, I was doing that as service work, and somebody spoke to me one time I was there and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about doing this for money?"
Yeah.
I was working with adolescents in their adolescent program. This was 2001. So I don't know what you were doing in 2001, but I said, yeah, I could give that a try, having never really thought about doing that kind of work before. And it was pretty shortly after starting to work there that I realized, oh, this is what I am supposed to do. And then, I made the decision that more than kind of continuing what I was doing there, which was essentially what's referred to as a tech, but what I found working in a lot of inpatient environments is that the techs do a fair bit of the actual counseling and talk therapy. And, rather than kind of continuing to do on that path, I thought to myself, I think, again, this is what I'm really supposed to do. And so I went back for a master's in counseling. And I guess another critical turning point would be the turn towards religious studies. I was some years later working for a university counseling center, for Vanderbilt University's counseling center, and knew that I was ready to kind of give private practice a try, and at the same time had gotten really interested in religious studies and the topic we're going to talk more about in particular. And so I took up in 2009 a PhD program, a whole new degree in religion, psychology, and culture. And that path ultimately, I think, essentially led me to talk to you. So maybe I'll say more about that piece of the story in a bit.
Fantastic. Okay, so one of the things that really struck me is that as I was reading the introduction and the acknowledgments to your book are some familiar names that I know as well. So like Pierce Salguero and Anne Gleig. And Anne was on this show, and I've noticed that they're both super influential scholars for you. So as an outside observer to religious studies, I'm finding that the field is actually pretty small and that everybody knows each other. Who are some of your biggest influences in the religious studies field?
Yeah, and I heard your interview with Anne. I thought it was fantastic, and both Anne and Pierce are influences on me, and they've been really helpful and encouraging in my work. And I also consider them friends. They're really great people, and there's a reason why all three of us know each other, which is that we're definitely working in overlapping fields. Maybe I'll mention a couple of people that are not maybe immediate immediate people that might jump out to somebody that kind of knows the field of Buddhist studies, or in the case of Pierce, religion and medicine, and Pierce works on Buddhist traditions and medicine and healings, I guess would be the short way of saying it. So one scholar who I've barely spoken to, Anne and Pierce I've had many conversations with, is a guy named Brent Nongbree. And maybe I'm thinking maybe you can put his name in the show notes or something, or I could spell it.
Oh, for sure. No, I can do it.
Cool. So he wrote a book called Before Religion, which is, to me, one of the more reader-friendly introductions to what is a core piece of my book, which is the idea that, or the history of the concept of religion, which is a relatively new concept in human history. It's only a couple 100 years old, and before. Some people date it to the Reformation, what we call the European Reformation. Some people date it to what we call European Enlightenment. Before that point, the humans didn't walk around thinking of the world as divided up into religious and not religious spheres of life. There was just the universe, which ran based on, if you were a Protestant in Europe, it was based on God's law, and so. My book very much is influenced by that, what was for me a revelation as a practicing therapist getting into religious studies, but even though that for religious studies scholars is kind of old news, and it totally shaped the way that I approached my work. Maybe I'll name one other scholar who's been also, or two other scholars that have also been really supportive to me, just because I feel like I can't not name them. One is David McMahon, who is also in the Buddhist studies world, and wrote a really central. I think you talked about him with Anne, the making of Buddhist modernism. He was kind enough to actually be the outside reader on my dissertation committee.
Nice.
And then a woman named Anne Harrington, who wrote a book called The Cure Within, which is a history of mind-body medicine. And she teaches at Harvard and does history of science and historical methodologies is one of the main methodologies of the book. And she's been really helpful and opened up a lot of intellectual doors for me.
That is so cool. I'm writing down some of these titles as well because you're giving me a whole bunch of things that I can jump off of and go from here. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So let's dive in a little bit to your brand new book, Prescribing the Dharma, Psychotherapists, Buddhist Traditions, and Defining Religion, which is out now from the University of North Carolina Press. So I love University of North Carolina Press, by the way. I've had several authors from them on the show, and it's always great. They're so kind and helpful and supportive. So this book, in the book, it says this is the first comprehensive work of religious studies scholarship to elucidate the diversity of ways psychotherapists in the U.S. have related to Buddhist teachings and practices. How long was this book in the works for you?
So it depends on how you look at it. So, I before religious studies scholarship was ever kind of a twinkle in my eye, I was a practicing therapist who got introduced to Buddhist teachings and practices, or certainly what I was told were Buddhist teachings and practices, or derived from them. And was finding them to be helpful for the people that were coming to see me for therapy, and that led me to do study of this topic. But most of the books that are out there on this topic still, and certainly then, were books that were written by psychotherapists for other psychotherapists. And so, it's varying how much clinical practice focused versus kind of theory. There's a dichotomy there, theory practice, maybe a false one. But different books would sort of vary in their approaches. But they were, again, for the most part, were written by therapists for other therapists. Mm-hmm. They usually were, they were often edited collections, and they usually had a selection from a scholar or historian. And I always found those chapters really interesting. So, cut to 2009, like I mentioned, or 2007, 8. And when I was speaking to the man that became my first reader on my dissertation, Volney Gay, who is a psychologist of religion at Vanderbilt. That means that he interprets religion using psychology, specifically using psychoanalysis. So he'll explain why somebody believes in God or the God image they have using psychoanalysis. And it was really through conversations with Volney that I made the decision to take up religious studies scholarship and get in a full way of working towards another degree,
nice.
the PhD. Yeah,
cool.
And that ultimately led to this particular project.
Awesome. So as a former PhD student myself, I didn't actually finish, but I took methods courses, so I know enough to be dangerous. Tell me a little bit about the methodology that you used for the study.
So it's primarily a historical literature analysis. So the primary methodology of the book is combing through the texts that therapists have written, and religious studies scholars and historians have written about psychotherapists. In particular, I also, was using literature from Buddhist studies field. I did a minor in looking at the medieval China and the communities that we would call Buddhists, interactions with the communities we would today call Taoists. I did that minor because many people kind of compare what's going on today in the U.S. to previous times in history when Buddhist traditions were introduced to new communities, and in particular, medieval China when they're coming up from India. But historical and literature study was not the only methodology I used. I also used or borrowed, I should, as the way I like to put it, some methodologies from sociology of religion, anthropology of religion, and so I did what I call expert interviews with therapists, published therapists whose work I was reading. And we're still alive to be able to for me to be able to interview them. So someone like Erich Fromm, I couldn't ask, when you're using religion here, it seems like you're using that word in this way, but over here, it seems like you're using it to mean this. But somebody like Barry Magid, I could ask that question too.
Mm-hmm.
I also am hopeful that they could be sort of not just representative of different approaches, but we might think of them as influencers. They are prominent and published and speakers. And so I thought to myself, we may be able to tell something about the way wider communities of therapists approach Buddhist traditions based on some of these influencers. I also did some what they call participant observation, which meant I already kind of had this status of being a therapist myself. I was already what they call an insider to a certain extent. But I did some more formal participant observation of continuing education conferences. So conferences where therapists go to learn about how different approaches to Buddhist traditions. And so I did some observation there. Also thinking to myself, this might, again, tell us more about how these same therapists that I was focused on, who were published and who were speaking at these conferences, how they might be influencing wider communities of therapists.
So something I'm curious about. So I'm a teacher, just a high school teacher, and so I'm obviously not a psychotherapist, and I'm not a Buddhist studies scholar. But I really enjoyed the book. Who do you hope will connect as the audience for this book? Who are you writing to, do you think?
It's so cool to just hear that question and to hear that you came upon it and that you found it to be interesting and the hope is that the book will connect with as wide an audience as possible. It is written specifically first kind of at a first level to religious studies scholars, to religious studies scholars of a really wide diversity, because the book, obviously exists at kind of the intersection of multiple disciplines: religion and medicine, religion and science, Buddhist studies. Primarily, my degrees in religion, psychology, and culture. But so multiple kinds of spheres of or segments of religious studies scholars. I also, am certainly hopeful, and it seems like it is connecting with practicing psychotherapists.
Excellent.
And Buddhist practitioners and communities of committed and or casual Buddhist practitioners.
That's super interesting, because something that I've been trying to follow the last few years is a little bit about the research on what universities are doing to study things like the effects of meditation on the brain, and how are these techniques being used in a secular context. And Anne Gleig's book does a really amazing job about talking about the arguments that the secular and the religious communities are having over using these techniques in different ways. And so, I was reading this book, and I'm curious for your perspective on this as a psychotherapist. I was reading page 1, and I thought to myself, what do we know for sure about treating depression with meditation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So, I always hesitate at this point, because as a practitioner, my job is to be as what they call a consumer, great word, of, scientific research on, things like depression in general and the effectiveness of meditation. that is less my focus as a scholar, is the kind of scientific research out there, except for as a cultural and historical, a cultural and intellectual historian of that research. So I always hesitate to speak to the question of, is meditation actually effective for depression? There is a vibrant debate on that question. However, what I can say is that there is a lot of research out there that is presented as indicating that meditation can be very helpful for people with depression. There was a whole treatment modality born out of the idea that meditation practices could be helpful for depression relapse. So, what I always encourage my students in counseling is to be aware of that research, but also to be always looking at it with a critical eye, because there's also research out there prominently, just you can name mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and the researchers there, and to name a researcher on another side. Although maybe I shouldn't make a false dichotomy of them, but a woman named Willoughby Britton has also reported on the research that shows that meditation can sometimes deepen depression in some cases. And so, what I believe is that the research is helpful. We always want to look at it with a critical eye and to be actively engaged with what it does and does not tell us, because it certainly gives us information, and then there's limits to the information it gives. And one of the big limits to me is that I think it's rarely helpful to say one must do this with all people at all times based on these studies.
Yeah, for sure. And so from the book, I also gather that psychotherapists in the field are like receptive to different techniques, and they're comfortable to varying degrees, like depending on the therapist, of course, and using these Buddhist techniques in their practices. So, like, is there a spectrum of comfort from like explicitly Buddhist and owning that, like in sessions, to like presenting something that has Buddhist origins as like entirely secular?
That is the one of the main aims of the book.
Awesome. Okay.
is to one of the difficult, when I started doing reading and combing through, looking at the research that did exist out there on this topic, or related topics, what I found was that a lot of commentary, whether from religious studies scholars or just cultural commentators out there, seem to say therapists are secularizing Buddhist traditions, or at a certain point later on, would push back on those interpretations and say, well, actually, no, what's really happening here is, quote unquote, the spread of the Dharma. This is really religious transmission. And there are a lot of levels to those arguments that we could talk more about at some point. But what I knew as a practitioner before I ever did any research was that people that were saying this is the secularization of Buddhism, I put that in quotes, obviously didn't know the therapists that I knew, just from down the street, so to speak, who were deep believing, considered themselves to be deep believing Buddhists, and would actually talk about Buddhist doctrine in sessions, and vice versa. The people that were saying this is religious transmission, obviously, weren't taking therapists at their word when they said, we are secularizing this. This is secular, and didn't weren't thinking to the educator or trainer out there who were teaching people in something like the very popular mindfulness practices without themselves knowing anything about their Buddhist origins. And so we're having generations of people being taught this thing without any sort of connection to Buddhist traditions or the concept of religion. So, the book does history. It does what's called ethnography. That's the some of those anthropological and sociological study of religion approaches I was mentioning earlier. But what I really think of it as is as a typology, and each chapter of the book presents a different set of approaches that therapists have taken to Buddhist traditions to try to give us a full sense of the real diversity of ways that therapists have approached Buddhist traditions throughout history.
So in the book, you outline 6 approaches that therapists have taken to Buddhist traditions within therapy. Can you give a brief overview for the listener to make these distinctions clear?
Yes. Now, to do so, I have to go back to Before Religion, which is the title of that book that I mentioned earlier, that speaks to this whole body of scholarship that informs us of how the concept of religion, as different from other spheres of life that are not religious, is a relatively new and recent concept. And so when that was a revelation to me when I started getting into religious studies scholarship, even though it was is old news, I think, to religious studies scholars. But to me, I said, this should shape the way that we talk about this topic. It should totally transform whether when we make a definitive statement, this is religion or this is secular, in one way or another. And for me, the way that I wanted it to inform what I did was, well, what we should do is look at what the communities themselves are saying about what is and is not religious. And then we can learn more about the way these concepts actually function in people's lives and work on the ground. And so what I found when I started doing that was that psychotherapists had a diversity of definitions, or at least they expressed a diversity of definitions of the religious and not religious, and put them often into kind of debate and contestation with each other, and that therapists' understandings of what is and is not religious actually generated or certainly helped mold the approaches that they took to Buddhist traditions. And so, some communities of therapists, some therapists are extremely invested in being defined as not religious practitioners. And if they are, they're going to take certain kinds of approaches to Buddhist traditions, while other therapists are not only unperturbed by the idea that they might be considered a Buddhist therapist, they actually say that they're practicing Buddhist psychotherapy. And so they would take a different kind of approach. And so each of the chapters kind of maps out a different set of approaches. The categories are artificial, but they hopefully kind of give us a sense of the texture, give us a sense of the diversity that is out there, as again shaped by therapists' understandings of what is and is not religious.
Fantastic.
So the first one is therapized. I call therapized religion approaches. So, as I say, each set of approaches is therapists approaching what they consider to be religion in a particular way. Whether someone else would consider it to be religion or not is less important. So, at least for this book. And so there are psychotherapists out there that will have approached Buddhist traditions as using the filter of psychotherapeutic ideas and concepts, evaluating Buddhist traditions based on how psychotherapeutically useful they might be, whether a particular Buddhist idea is psychotherapeutically healthy or not. And so rather than psychology of religion, I thought to myself, this is kind of therapizing religion. The second approach is filtering religion approaches. And filtering religion approaches are where you have therapists taking up science and scientific research and kind of using that scientific research to try to filter the religious materials kind of away out of particular Buddhist ideas or practices. So they'll say, you have this practice here, and it may have come from a religious tradition, but we now have this science, and when we apply these scientific studies to it, we can generate something that is no longer religious. And so they're kind of filtering the religion out of it, or, and another kind of meaning of it, they view science as kind of being able to create, to find the essence of a religious tradition, Buddhist traditions. And so what's left from the filtering process would be kind of like the essential core of that religious tradition. So a kind of filtered coffee, as you will.
Gotcha, yeah.
The third is translating religious approaches, and these kinds of approaches is what we're most familiar with. I feel like is the most popular, because mindfulness-based practices I view as coming as just a really prominent example of translating religion approaches. And here, a therapist takes up a practice or teaching that they view to be religious, and they translate it into not religious terms, medical, scientific terms. The fourth are personalizing religion approaches. And personalizing religion approaches are where you have therapists who are in their quote unquote personal lives, sometimes not just deep believing Buddhist practitioners, but can even be Buddhist teachers, founders of Buddhist communities, but they don't ever actually talk about any of that in their therapy sessions. In their therapy sessions themselves, if you were listening to them and didn't know what you might listen for, you would not know that session to be any different from any other therapist sessions. However, those therapists who in their personal lives are Buddhists, that what they'll say often is that it's not like that's not in the room with them. It's just held in what therapists refer to as the person of the therapist. They're kind of holding it internally and silently in their person, and thus it is personalized. The fifth approach I just call adopting religion, and I'll say that all of these phrases I tried to draw from the titles of the different approaches. I tried to draw from the language of the therapist I was listening to and reading, but none of them do I love so much. And all of these categories are artificial. In any case, adopting religion is where you have therapists who full on will kind of adopt Buddhist traditions, in some cases as the bases for their therapies. And so they'll even refer to their therapy as a Buddhist psychotherapist or psychotherapy or a Zen psychoanalysis. There are more kinds of ways that therapists adopt religion than just that, but for time's sake, I'll just name that one. And then the final one is I call integrating religion approaches. And here, I mean, to a certain extent, one could argue all of these are, integrating approaches. But what I'm trying to highlight are approaches that where the practitioners believe that they are integrating Buddhist and psychotherapeutic frames in such a way that both are still recognizable. That is a mixture between the two, where one is not necessarily subsumed within the other.
Interesting. Okay, so all these expert interviews that you did, I'm kind of curious about these. So did any of the psychotherapists you spoke to for these interviews tell you about choosing or not choosing to use Buddhist-oriented or inspired techniques on someone in their office for therapy who was like outwardly like a devout practitioner of another religion? Like, for example, if somebody comes into their office and they are obviously like an Orthodox Jewish person, or they are obviously Muslim, do any of these therapists have any qualms with using these Buddhist-inspired techniques on somebody who is, devout from another faith or religious tradition?
Well, first of all, I have to note some personal history here, which is that a big piece of a big driver of my interest came out of an experience in this topic. Came again, at least a year or three before I would have ever thought of doing this. When I was giving just as a therapist, giving a presentation to a pastoral counseling center on the use of mindfulness-based practices in therapy, and I thought to myself, "Oh, this is a pastoral counseling center, and these are it's ecumenical, but that itself is a Christian word, and they're mostly going to be Christian practitioners. I should be sort of aware, and I should speak to this exact question that you're bringing up."
Yeah, but it's just interesting.
Yeah, and so I prepared like a whole segment of the training on it, and then found that they really didn't seem to have this question. Did not really have concern about this, which I thought was was really interesting. And it might have just been that crowd, but it remains a question that's really interesting to me and is very much a debated topic amongst people, certainly amongst people that are writing and like theorizing on this topic. And so what I'll say is that the short answer is yes. There are certainly therapists out there that are concerned about how traditions, teachings, and practices that they may think of as Buddhist can or should be introduced to people who identify from a different religious tradition. And so there's a really active debate about that. There are some people who very strongly believe that one shouldn't be using even those practices that therapists consider to be secularized versions of Buddhist practices. You have people who strongly state, no, it's still carrying with it that Buddhist past, and you are still either violating the quote unquote secularity of the space, or in one way or another, this is something that shouldn't be done. And so I think that this is a question that we definitely want to be thinking more and talking more about. But this is the twist that I can, and I thought a lot about the concept of informed consent here, and I'm actually going to be having an article coming out on that soon.
Awesome.
On these questions. This is just the one piece that I don't feel like I hear people mention often, that I feel like I want to try to put it out there to complicate this debate. And that is psychotherapy as a whole, and the practices that make up psychotherapy can be traced back to multiple other traditions, Protestant traditions. The founder of talk therapy as we know it was a Jew living in a anti-Jewish world of Austria, and the practices that he was taking up and were influenced by things we call mesmerism today, and he was thinking about ambient energies or influenced by ideas of ambient energies and so on. And so, I had a colleague in my PhD program wrote his dissertation on the talking cure and confession and the relationship between these different kinds of practices. And so all that to say that it's just really complicated. One of my big messages is always, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And, when somebody introduces the talking cure and they say, just speak stream of consciousness, they could say, this has its roots in Catholic confession before they did that. Most do not.
Gotcha. So, with this wide variety and this spectrum of techniques that therapists are okay with, I'm also curious about the observant Buddhist leaders in the world. So I'm curious if there's been any pushback on the secularization of these techniques, because you write that a concrete understanding to define activities as religious, scientific, or secular will always be stymied because of these terms to remain in constant flux depending on how they are used. So is the line between secular and religious even like real at this point? How do the people who take the secularization debate seriously, what are their thoughts on all this?
Well, what I would say is it is both very, very real and imaginary. And the imaginary part of the lines between the religious and not religious that we all live with make the very hard lines between religious and not religious subvertible. So let me actually, I don't know if subvertible is a word, but let me explain what I mean by this. So first of all, there is a lot of pushback on the secularization of these techniques. There's a whole host of critiques about the quote unquote secularization of Buddhist traditions. And again, there's a very active and lively debate about it as well that I'm hoping that I can speak to. And one of the ways I want to speak to it is to say again, if we think of these terms as invented terms, if it's a very recent thing that human beings have thought of, this sphere of life over here is religious and this sphere of life over here is not religious, shouldn't that change the way we talk about it at least? And then from there we can say, well, how should it change it? But I feel like we're still at the first step on that. And now, what I found, and the conclusion of my book lays out 6 findings that are all related to just this, not just this topic, but all go to what we can say about the religious and not religious using psychotherapist approaches to Buddhist traditions as a case study. And, one of the first things, and it's not the first one of the findings that's listed here, but one of the first things we have to say is that, these terms may be invented, but they have very, very real consequences in people's lives. And it may be an imaginary idea that this sphere of life over here is religious and this is not, but it can have major impacts on the way that a therapist will help somebody and when they will and will not introduce something to suffering people. And, some people, you asked, is the line between secular and religious even real at this point? One of the findings in that conclusion all goes to the fact that I would regularly hear from the therapists that I interviewed. They had heard this historical, or at least heard something about this history that, these are concepts. And so I would hear people say like, well, religion and secular are just concepts. Like, I don't even think in terms of them. But what I found is that they still were acting as if they thought about them. Their choices were still shaped by them. And, we can't just, whether we want to or not, we can't just dismiss them, whether we'd like to or not. There are people being sued for using mindfulness practices in public schools. And so by extension, those same lawsuits could apply to their use in public hospitals potentially.
Yeah. Well, something that a quote that just jumps out at me from what you just said is on page 19, you write, "In keeping with legal statutes of a publicly funded state institution, a clinician will radically transform a Buddhist practice to make it verifiable to scientific authorities." So, what I'm thinking about is, if this were drawn from, a monotheistic religion, I could see people who were not observant of monotheistic traditions looking twice at this line and, being alarmed. How would you explain this to a patient in your own practice? Do you explain to a patient every time that you do something that is inspired by Buddhism? Does that make sense?
Well, I think that if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think this goes back to what I was saying a little while ago. Every time that somebody, it may be rarer and rarer that a therapist actually asks someone that's coming to see them for therapy to speak stream of consciousness. But every time they did that, they might want to say, there's an argument that this has roots in Catholic confession.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's really complicated. It's really complicated is one of my big messages. And, what I ask is, how many generations does it take before we forget that psychotherapy was influenced by mesmerism? That, talk therapy happens every day here in the U.S. And, I just don't think many of the practicing therapists are thinking about ambient energies or so on. The metaphor I use in the book is a Christmas tree. I say, it's many people know that the Christmas tree is derived from what we call Roman traditions today.
Sure.
And but today it is definitely part of Christian practice. And so how many generations does it take? Did it take before the Christmas tree becomes authentically Christian, even as we still are talking about it, right? And so it still has that, that conversation to it. And, the joke I use is, if the Christmas tree falls into a forest and no one's there for the historian to tell the tale, does it make a sound? There's much more to be said about this. Can I say one more piece, which is just that all of this means that, a state-funded hospital can still be the lines that the hospital authorities, the human beings that run that hospital are drawing or may not draw between what's religious and not. Those lines can be subverted precisely because these terms and these concepts remain in flux.
Is it hard to deal with insurance companies when a therapist does something that is inspired by Buddhism?
I think it is hard to answer that question. First of all, that is an area of research that I feel like people should do that I have not done.
Oh, cool. Nice.
It would be interesting to do actual scientific research on, how many therapists are shaped. Actual qualitative or quantitative research on, how, often, therapists are shaped by insurance considerations. I think that, thinking of that state-run hospital, again, I think that they are thinking about insurance utilization reviews. But, how many therapists are sitting in their private practice offices and thinking to themselves, my treatment may not get covered if I use this particular practice, I think is different. But, that topic was a topic that definitely came up frequently in my discussions. And it's certainly one, insurance companies are one of the gatekeepers. They're one of those external authorities that are shaping and concerns about insurance and managed health are definitely one of the external authorities that are shaping these different approaches to Buddhist traditions.
It's really hard. And so something else I'm noticing in the book is your acknowledgement of some therapists that use techniques that are derived from Buddhism while also having no knowledge of the foundations of things like the Satipatthana Sutta of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So there's like a lack of knowledge on the history of the topic while also using the techniques professionally. Do you think that the surge of mindfulness-based therapy and therapists should have to study the history of these techniques in order to fully grasp what it is that they are doing every day?
Well, I noticed that you used the word "have to," which speaks to, again, a word I used a moment ago, and that's authority. Mm-hmm. The question is, are we going, should they have to? And who's going to enforce that?
Yeah.
There are people that want to do that want to say there should be certification processes. There should be ways to authenticate somebody's use of, to use that example, mindfulness-based practices. And that somebody, in the same way that, I can't call myself, I'm a mental health counselor is my professional designation. And you're not allowed to advertise as a counselor or a social worker or a psychologist unless you're licensed, which puts you under the auspices and under the dictates of both ethical boards from the discipline and state-run and state statutes as well. So there are people that do say, if you're going to say that you're a mindfulness-based therapist, you need to do this, this, and this, and that people shouldn't be able to say that they are without doing this. From my perspective, I'm going to draw on another word that you used there, which is history. And what I would say is that, one of my big messages is it's complicated. And the other one is it is worth being aware of our history. It's worth being aware of where we come from, and so that we can better understand where we stand and what is shaping our choices. And so, whether that be Buddhist doctrine or the history of the Gestalt psychotherapists who were talking about who were saying be here now when they had never heard this word mindfulness before, way before mindfulness practices were a thing. Whatever that history is, we want to. I think the more aware that we can be of our history, whether we're a therapist or a religious studies scholar, the better, the more intentioned and conscious our choices are going to be about what we think should be done in therapy or should be written about, and so on.
Something that I'm actually experiencing a great deal of relief listening to some of your answers, because you keep using the terms, it's complicated. And as a teacher in a high school classroom teaching religious studies to American 18-year-olds, so many of the times they would ask a question and my answer would be one of two things. It depends, or it's complicated. Yeah. And so I'm really glad to hear that somebody else is really into that as an answer, because
I'll just having worked with adolescents for a long time and knowing about adolescent brain development, that can be difficult to not to go to the to be working with the abstract versus the concrete. But sorry, please.
Yeah, they're like, should we put this in the paper or not? And I was like, well, it depends, and it drives them crazy. But it's also a really, really hilarious motif that springs up throughout the course of a school year.
Yes.
So you write that there are other religious techniques, and you talked about these a lot: confession, mesmerism, energy manipulation, exorcism, and all of these are reconstructed within psychotherapeutic contexts. So I assume that there are therapists like the Buddhist-inspired ones in the book who offer therapy from Judaism-based or Muslim-based or Christian-based therapy techniques as well. Do you know anything about other theologically or religiously inspired therapists in the country that you've communicated with?
Yes. So, and part of that came from the PhD program that I went through, because one of the major tracks of that program was people basically getting a PhD in pastoral counseling. And although, pastoral counseling as a discipline, pastoral counselors want their discipline to be open to non-Protestant traditions, just as representative, I was the second non-Protestant student, I believe. Now I'm hesitating, I may be overstating it, but I believe I was the second non-Protestant student to go through there. The other was a Catholic, and then and I'm Jewish. So, there is a whole discipline of helping discipline of pastoral care and counseling and chaplaincy, and that work with primarily the majority of them are Protestant traditions. And, again, the very language of that means that if you're a Jewish chaplain, you might think of that phrase as a contradiction in terms, So there is a lot. This is actually a chapter that I'm also working on right now, that is adapted from research I did when I was in that program. is, looking at whether the phrase Buddhist chaplain is actually a contradiction in terms, and looking at how some of the same kind of debates that are going on amongst Buddhist communities have been going on for a long time amongst communities of pastoral care and counselors around the how to use the word integrate the psychotherapeutic and in most of their cases, the Protestant.
Interesting. Okay. So what do you see as being the future of the field that you're working within?
That's a great question.
Some future research directions, obviously.
Yeah. What I would say, so I'll speak to the field of psychotherapists interested in Buddhist traditions, I think is what you're asking.
Yeah.
But I'll also throw in another one. One thing I wonder is how often the future of the field will amount to a phrase that I just wrote this morning: a reinventing of the wheel, if not the Dharma wheel, is my joke on it, because the debates that people are most kind of wrestling with today, many of them were being discussed in the 1940s through 1970s, and so but those debates are not happening with reference to those figures. Now, I think there are more people who are talking about concerns about kind of capitalization, how capitalists are using particular Buddhist practices. I think more people are talking about that today than when one of the people I wrote about, Eric Fromm, was writing about that in the 1970s. But again, it's some of the same arguments kind of here again. So that's another reason why history could be important to look to. I think the thing that I'm thinking about most on this topic is that, my book focuses on the way that people's understandings, the way people define what is and is not religious, how those understandings shaped these diverse approaches to Buddhist traditions. And one of the major findings the last one that I end the book with is kind of looking at a theme that surfaces throughout the book, and that is kind of the values and principles, the ethics that shape all of this as well. And more what I think about when I hear people debating, is this religious or not religious? I think that very often what they're actually debating is this good or bad? Mm-hmm. But of course, what is good to one person is bad to another. So when somebody says, no, this is not secularized, it's still Buddhist, that person may be saying that to an audience that is, to an audience that is concerned that if it was otherwise, it would be bad. But then someone else can hear them saying that and quote them in court to say, this is bad. We're violating the Establishment Clause of the United States. I want to restate that to make sure that that's clear.
Yeah.
I would hear therapists who were accused of secularizing, or as far as they were concerned, they were being accused of a crime of secularizing Buddhist traditions, and they would say, no, don't be concerned. This is still Buddhist, and let me explain to you how this is still Buddhist. And to them, secularization would be bad in that context, right? Mm-hmm. But somebody else can say, well, if it's still Buddhist, that is bad. You cannot use that in a public hospital. And they'll take that person's words and this has literally happened, argue that what that therapist is doing is bad because they are using a religious practice with people that may not want a religious practice in their therapy. And so again, it's really complicated, but I think that it's the ethics that it's the good and the bad of it that that people have been talking about for a long time, and that my argument is we should start being clear. This is what we're arguing about. Like, we should be clear that what we're arguing about is ethics here, if we're participating in that argument.
Well, there's been a lot of really fantastic details in this conversation, too, about the importance of informed consent and doing what is best for the people who are coming to therapists for help, and also just, responding in kind to what works and what doesn't based on the comfort level of the person coming to see you. So, I mean, it's really great. And yes, it's very complicated, and this book really dives into this fantastic spectrum of what therapists are comfortable doing and how they're going about it. So I think that it's just an interesting read for anybody to dive into if they're curious about these topics. Where can people find you if they want to know more? Like, where would you turn their attention to for further information?
Thanks for that question, because I hope that if listeners are interested, that they won't hesitate to reach out. And I have now entered the digital age. I'm on social media, on Facebook and Twitter as Dr. Ira Helderman, all one word. Probably the easiest way to find me is irahelderman.com.
Nice. I didn't even know that. Do we follow each other on Twitter yet?
We do.
Okay, we do. Good. I forget. Like, I'm all over the place on that. So I will. I'll make sure that I go and check out all your stuff as well. So, Dr. Ira Helderman, this has been a really fascinating conversation about your profession, your new book, and the ethics of psychotherapy and Buddhist-inspired techniques. I'm really grateful to you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fantastic.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com. or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.